It's pretty cool to be here. I grew up going to Bronco games at Old Mile High, so being in this room, standing in front of this podium is pretty awesome. So, sure, yeah, go for it. I'm going to talk. You can take my picture if you want, right? I'm going to kick this thing off with a story, okay? Once upon a time, there was this developer, and this developer worked at a company, right, that built this e-commerce application, right? And before you ask, no, it was not Amazon, all right? But it had an application that was very Amazon-ish, right? And this developer had a name. We're going to call him Dustin, okay? Now, Dustin was responsible for working on the customer portal of this application, right? The spot where customers could come in and log in, view their accounts, manage their orders, look at order details, that sort of thing, right? And so one day, Dustin, along with his other development team, along with the quality assurance team, the product owners, were in a backlog grooming session, right? They had a bunch of tickets, stories, features they wanted to prepare, and they needed to point these to identify the estimation of work, right? And so they could plan them for the next sprint. And so during this meeting, there was this one feature that they really wanted to get in place, pretty high important feature. And currently in the application, when a customer viewed their order, they saw this breakdown of shipments, right? And they had separate shipments for that order, each line item in that shipment, along with a ship date. Well, business got wind of social media being crazy fire. Customers were super upset, complaining about this experience, said it was too complex, especially when they were looking on their mobile phone. And so businesses come back and said, hey, we want to simplify this, right? Our ask here is to just show the line items and then put the ship date next to it and get rid of all of this shipment information, right? So product owners confirmed with the team, everybody understands the ask here, right? So now it's time to point this thing. So this company used the Fibonacci scale to do their pointing. So it goes something like this. Starts with a 1, then goes to 2, then to 3, then to 5, then up to 8, then up to 13, and then there's a lot of ludicrous numbers after that that nobody ever uses, right? So the team was going to point this. Now Dustin, he had pretty intimate knowledge of this application, knew it well. So he stepped up and said, hey, yeah, going to have to give this thing 8 points. Product owners were in shock, right? Like 8 points. Again, we're talking about this simple feature, right? We're talking about removing some stuff from the display and then kind of moving this ship date over, right? Should be pretty straightforward. Dustin says, well, sure, the actual work to do the application change, to do that code change, pretty straightforward, right? But let me tell you everything that we have to go through in this development experience to make sure we do this right? The first thing we need to do is we need to set up some sample data, right? We're going to need to create a test account to use or use an existing account. But of course, we got other developers, maybe they're using that same account, so we probably don't want to do that, right? Then we got to create an order. That order has to have multiple shipments on it, right? Because that's the feature that we're testing. But we probably also want to create an order with only a single shipment on it because we want to make, it's sharing the same view here, so we want to make sure that still works, right? Then we got to put those shipments into a ship state so we see that ship date to make sure we're implementing this feature, right? Then once we've got all that initial data set up, and we're doing this in our dev database, then we've got to actually launch the app while we're working on it, right, to confirm this change. And then we got to log in as a customer. We have to find the order that we wanted to look for, right, in terms of the one with multiple shipments. And then we have to view the details of that order. And oh, by the way, remember that we don't have any deep linking to view the order details. So when we're doing the development and we get live reload in our browser, we got to pretty much repeat that same process each time we make a little change. So a lot of work that goes into that, right? So before the product owners could even respond to that and mention anything, QA steps up to the table. Yeah, we're going to have to bump that thing up to a 13. And at this point, it's like mass chaos, right? And it's like 13, why? And QA reminds everybody, look, we have a separate quality assurance database, so we have to set up the same data over there and do the same steps that the developers have to do in order to do our work, right? So meeting took a real bummer at this point, right? Everybody's like, come on, this is like pretty much a full sprint's worth of work, right, to do this one feature change. But everybody kind of settled in and realized, look, that's just the way it is, right? That's the world that we're living in. But I mean, is it really, like, this can be better, right? So I'm here to tell you and to help us understand how bringing a strategy for working components in isolation is going to help us be more productive across all of our teams, right? So now, because we're building on Angular, we actually get a big benefit here. It's already built for this isolation concept, right? Angular is built on components. It's a component framework. Each of these components are designed to encapsulate some bit of logic, from the template to the styles to the scripts that run it. And Angular provides this API for us to interact with it, a way to do inputs to get data in, outputs to report out events and behavior from our components, right? And they're really designed as these little widgets that we can make portable and use throughout and compose what we need to compose, right? All we really need is the tooling in our workflow to be able to do this type of isolation work. All right, so a show of hands if you want. Anybody heard of Storybook? Okay. Anybody using Storybook? All right, cool, cool. How about Angular Playground? Anybody heard of Angular Playground? All right, cool. Anybody using it? Okay. All right, so both Storybook and Angular Playground are web applications, additional tooling that allows us to run components in isolation. So both of them can do the job here. There may be others out there. You can build your own. The point is we want to have some tooling to do that, right? During this talk, I'm going to focus on Storybook, but again, any of these will work. So when we talk about isolation, what are we talking about, right? We're really talking about the ability to render our components so we can see it running in the browser outside of our app, right? Typically, we only know inside of our app that we're running that. So we need a tool to do that. It's about the ability to mock our data that we hand to our components, as well as services that it uses, right? So we don't have to rely on the actual services or the actual data. And then on the other side, it's about being able to identify that these events were emitted from our components. The behavior was happening on our components. And at the heart of it, it's really similar to unit tests. We write a unit test, we set up some mock data, we test some isolated piece, and then we confirm behavior on the outside, right? With isolation, we're really doing that same thing, but running it in the browser, doing it on the user experience side of our components. So let's take a quick look in here in terms of some code of what this experience is like. In Angular, we have something like a component. We have this checkout button component. We would create a stories.ts file next to that. Same way we would create a spec.ts file, so it lives with the component. And in Storybook, there's just this API. It's pretty simple. You kind of describe the category that you want, so it's this component, and then you can set up scenarios where you say, here's the component, here's maybe the sample data A, sample data B, and you're off and running, right? And then we run Storybook like we run our application. It's a web app, so we run it, serve it from our project, and we get this UI. And the UI shows this menu system down the side. It gives us a list of all the components that we've written stories for and all the scenarios for each of those components. And then on the right, we have this canvas that renders our component in the browser, standalone from our application, right? All right, so the benefits, let's go over quickly the benefits of that at a high level, and then we're going to dive deep into each of these. So we're going to be able to increase productivity. This is one of the biggest things. Lucas's talked a lot about that cycle and all these things that we can do. We're going to kick that up a notch by utilizing isolation here and throwing that into the mix. We're going to be able to deliver faster and in parallel. We're going to be able to shard the work that we have. So with this feature, we're going to be able to break that thing up and have different teams work on it simultaneously to deliver faster. We're going to get less regression out of it because we're going to be able to really focus on the work that we're doing and confirm that it's doing these things outside of other kind of impact and stuff like that. And then we're going to get higher quality out of it. When we're building our components in isolation, we're really focused on the component and the needs of that component and how it should behave, and we're not impacted by other outside forces, right? All right, we're going to break this thing down into 3 parts. We're going to talk about how we can make different sets of people happy. So we're going to focus first on happier devs and happier QA, and we're going to kind of dive into productivity and how we're going to achieve that. So we're going to break everything down into a challenge and a solution. And so the first thing, we're going to talk about the challenge of building our components and doing our work within the scope of our app. And the solution is going to lie in when we bring in this working in isolation into the fold. So the first thing I want to cover is using app for runtime development, right? This is kind of the heart of it. We write some code and we're launching the app to see it work in the browser. So this requires app state, right? The app is the thing that's serving our component, so that has to be working. It has to have any of its setup data. If it has to call services or anything to get up and running, all that stuff has to work for us to do the work on the particular component we're working on or our teams are working on. It takes time to navigate and to fill out data to get there. In our example of the shipment line items change, right? We have to navigate in the browser through all those steps to get to the component rendering on the screen at that point, right? And it would confirm our work. And really, this is not fun. Developers, they want to be working on features and solving problems. They don't want to be doing this manual steps just to get there to get to their work, right? So when we work in isolation, we only need the component state. The app is not even present, right? So we just are caring about what that component needs, right? We get right to the runtime experience. We launched Storybook, we click on the component scenario we want, we're right there on the component. No navigation, no filling out billing and shipping information to get to the checkout confirmation screen just to see your code changes, right? And then we get live reload back. Because Storybook, you're deep linking right to that component. As a developer makes code changes and the browser reloads, then the code changes are seen right there. The developer doesn't even have to go to their browser and do any manual stuff to get back to that experience. All right, when we talk about confirming scenarios in the app, we're talking about when we interact with our components, when we're filling out data for it or clicking on things that it changes behavior. When we're doing that within the scope of the application, we have to manually try out different data entry or interactions. Say we want to confirm that a accordion opens or confirm that when we enter in data, client-side validation works. We got to do all that in the experience of our app, right? We also need to know how to trigger different scenarios. There may be some different behaviors logically of how our component behaves or how that feature behaves, and the person who's working on that needs to understand how to do those combinations to make the component behave like they want to behave, to confirm it's working in the browser. And then, because we're running the app, all the endpoints, they're live, they're hot, right? So the app is actually calling those. If we happen to be persisting data through that, then while we're doing our development work, we're actually altering the data in the database because we're running the app and it's doing its thing, right? When we work in isolation, we get to stage all the data. And we stage in a spot that in that story TS file, so we're actually saving that file to our code base. So we get to save that data that we staged, right, in a safe spot. We get to mock services out to simulate behavior. So if we have a login component that we're implementing and we want to confirm that the error messages show correctly, in this isolation, we can simply mock that service to return back the error, and then we can run it in Storybook and see that it performs in the way that we expected. If we're doing that in the app, then we're going to have to kind of hack around and know how to trigger those negative scenarios, and so that's a challenge. And then we're productive even if our network is down. So if the backend services are being worked on and deployed and we can't hit them right now, or internally in the office, our connections are down or VPN is down, our developers can still be productive when working on their components because they don't need that, right? Everything's mocked. And then when we talk about crafting our API for our components that we're building when we're implementing these features, when we're doing it within the app, developers will tend to lean towards data that they're getting from a parent component, right? So if this parent component already has an account object and they're building this new feature, they may say, well, there's an account object, I'll just use it and send it there, because they know that that's there, right? They're not focusing on just what the needs are of that particular feature that they're implementing. Then their naming kind of becomes coupled. They understand that when you're building it in that mindset, you understand the flow of the app all the way back up. You may start thinking about naming behaviors of your component because you know what it's going to affect up here. But truly that component lives on its own, so it shouldn't need to know about that and be connected to that. And then inbound data seems to work every time. The only place we put it is in the app, and the app always happens to have that data, right? But because it's a component, we could use it other places. But we might not know that, like, if we send it different type of data, that it's going to fall apart and break, right? And like Lucas was mentioning earlier, we won't know that until we actually put it out there and do that. But when we run in isolation, we get to know that right away. So it's really low effort to try out input tweaks, so we can really kind of sculpt and work our feature without being influenced by those other data that we already have coming up from upstream. And we can focus on the relevant behavior of this component, really saying, like, this is what it's supposed to do, let's build it and make it do that thing, regardless of where it's running, because again, it's a component that should be portable. And then we can confirm these negative scenarios, right? We can throw sample data, we can throw null data, there's no account. We could throw that at our component and see what it does. Did we actually build it in a way that's going to be resilient for that case? If we run it in the app's always sending it data. We don't discover that until later. All right, part 2, happier product owners. And we're going to talk about deliverables and how this increases that. Okay. So one of the challenges is this is blocked by. And this is a scenario where we're doing work and we have this chain of order that this thing needs to get done before this thing needs to get done, before this thing needs to get done, before QA can even get it, right? So endpoints need to get done, right? We're building a component and maybe there's some endpoints that it needs to call. We typically run it, because we're building it within the app, we're like, hey, look, we need the back-end team to complete these endpoints. We need the code to connect to them before we can do the component because we can't see anything work in our app. The parent component tree must be in place in our application. If we're talking about the line items in order, right, we need to have the app being able to navigate to an account, to an order. All those components need to be in place to then render the line items, right? And so all that scaffolding needs to be there when we're doing the development within the app. And then to get around that, we might end up writing like test sample code, right, or temporary code. We maybe create a separate route, or we take that component that we're working on and put it in the very top level component of the app so that it shows up right away, right, so we can see it. But that's not ideal. We don't want that, ship that code to production, right? So those big challenges that we deal with. When we work in isolation, we can do this work in parallel. We can start building the component, that feature, and separate out. We can mock the services. So now the team that's working on the services can do that same work at the same time. They're not relying on each other. And then we can just simply have an integration ticket where we come back once both those work is done to integrate it into our application. Mock data stays in our code base. It's actually a good spot to do it in our story configuration, right? That we want to put the mock data there. So we're okay with throwing some sample data there, saving it, committing it to our code base, because that's the home for it. All right, we also run into a scenario where we talk about getting QA involved late, quality assurance involved late. When we're in the scope of the app, QA has to wait until everything's done before they get the app handed to them to test, and then they have to test everything, whether the functional requirements and the design doc for that component got or that feature got created, if the client-side validation and behavior is working, as well as if it's running in the app. They got to do all that testing all at once it's delivered to them, right? If there happens to be any dev time that takes longer, if the feature takes longer to build out, QA gets pushed out even longer. So if there's a certification process for QA, now they're bottlenecked and waiting, right, on that entire thing to be completed. When we work in isolation, we've got this opportunity to say, okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to implement that design feature of that component. And then we're going to run it in the browser and share it with everybody. QA can see it, product owners can see it, stakeholders can see it right away, and we can confirm, does this design work? Does it look like we want it? And then we can start implementing behavior from there and test that. Right? So we can start do a next step where we validate scenarios in client-side interaction. Now, is this feature working the way we wanted it? When we fill out data, are the correct error messages showing up as we planned? We can now run that in that same scenario, again, outside of our app, get this to the teams faster, and continue work on the feature while that's going on. And then when we get to testing the actual integration in the app, there's less to test because we've already done all that stuff. QA has already certified that the design mocks were met. They've already certified the behavior. And now at this point, it's just they just have to confirm that it does work within the application. All right, app is the only home that we know. When we're building these things and using the app as the home for that, that's the only place we've ever seen this component of this feature built at, right? So when it comes time to reuse this thing, it can become complex. We don't have any understanding of how we're going to use it under this section of our app. We only have a blueprint of how it's used right here in this particular spot right now. Upstream dependencies are masked. We don't understand, all the app is running, so our component benefits from whatever's going on in the app, right? But if we move it to this other section, those things might not come with it, and we don't know that until we actually throw that in there. And we're not thinking of using it outside of that, right? Again, we're building these components that can be portable. They can run in our app. We could build another app tomorrow, and we want to use that same component. We're not thinking along those lines when we're only building in our app, because our mindset's really scoped towards this is the environment that it's built for. When we work in isolation, these scenarios that we start creating for how we use our component, they really become usage documentation. So we can set up different scenarios for our component that we're building. Say, here it is with this type of header. Here it is with no header. And we can set that up, and then in that code, in that story, we can look at and see, oh, that's how we use that. So when we go to say we want to apply that to a different part of our app, we have the use case scenario documented in our system. Again, this gets checked into our code base, so it goes along with it. And we get to understand dependencies. As soon as we put this component in isolation, the things that it needs, we identify it right away. It falls apart, right? And this is code-wise, so if there's services that it depends on, but also style-wise. If there's a parent component that is doing some styling to make this component look a certain way, when we put it outside of that app, it's not going to look that same way, and we can discover that right away, right, when we run it in isolation. And we get the benefit of prepping ourselves for Angular elements. Has anybody heard of Angular elements? Familiar with that? Okay. Anybody using that? All right, cool. So with Angular elements, it's just the idea that you're taking a component or a set of components and you're making them portable so they can run outside of your Angular app and be run out, not even in an Angular app, right? But to do that, your component has to be able to live on its own. When you're working in isolation, you're already preparing it to be able to do that, right? So you're like 90% of the way there. All right, part 3, happier users. We're going to talk about quality. This is one I call Schwartzenberger in production. So when we do design mocks, right, a lot of times we use sample data, John Doe, Jane Smith, that sort of thing. We're typically not taking in consideration 16 characters for a name, right? And so we'll end up creating those designs, we'll end up shipping that code, and then it'll be users that go and use it and are bummed now because the design did not meet that or did not support my long last name, right? And then dev and QA, the teams that are working on it, they have whatever data is in the sample database or whatever they could probably think of at that point to make sure that it looks and doing right? So they may not be thinking of all these different cases. So when we work in isolation, it's really trivial to add test data cases. We can set this component up to render with John Doe as the name. We can set it up to render with Justin Schwartzenberger as the name, and we can see it in action right away, and we can get confirmation that we need to tweak the design or whatnot earlier on in the game. And then everyone can throw data at it. Since Storybook is a web application, we could deploy it and run it places where anybody on our team can get to. Product owners, stakeholders, they could all get to it. They could all test it out. It also provides a way to set up knobs where you can control data input from the display in that storybook. So you could set up these text fields and things like that somebody could type in, I want to try this username or this heading text. And again, we can get that out to everybody on our team because it's a web app and everybody can be part of this process early and often. Reproducing defects. This is a big one that isolation really benefits. We get a problem in our app and we got to solve it. Well, when we're working in the app, we need to spin the app up and launch the app in order to get to that defect. So all of that app state is needed, the same stuff we talked about before, right? The app needs to be working, everything, in order to start debugging this defect and solving it. It can become complicated to do that traversal to get to that feature. Again, if we have a bug in the line items or in the cart checkout, right, and it's crucial, we need to get that done. But if we got to do all this dance in the scenario just to get to that, that's going to delay our time to push that out. So those are challenges. And then replicating data state can be challenging, right? Let's say we know the case is to replicate this is this component at this level needs this data, but in our app, maybe that data gets shaped by going through all the steps. So if we want to test in the app, we need to make sure we got all the pieces in place ahead of time so that we get the right data to our component to test that scenario, right? When we work on isolation, we get to focus on the affected UX, right? Again, we eliminate the complexity of the app and we say, let's just get right to the part that there's a problem and we can focus right on that. We get there right away. Again, we can launch that right away and don't have to do that other dance. And ultimately, it adds another scenario to our code base. We probably go in and say, hey, look, what was the case that caused that? It was the data with the name this way or missing shipments. We throw that data into a storybook story as code. We commit it. Now we can go back to our storybook at any time in the future, click on that scenario, and see that our component still works for that case as well. All right, almost done. Bringing it home. Let's wrap everything up. All right, so talk about the business value that we see out of this, right? Our devs and QA team, they spend a lot less time configuring that test data and dealing with the app, right? So it's big time saving there. We get to build out and validate these features earlier in a higher velocity. Again, we get to meet these design needs, test out this client interaction, and get that delivered to teams to confirm all in that process right away. We get to stage these scenarios and confirm that the changes to our code over time still work, right? So all this data that we put in there, these test cases, these scenarios, they're actually saved like unit tests, and we can run them against to confirm that we're not getting regressions and things like that. We get to discover design issues before we deliver code out to our users and our end users, right? Again, we have a way to test a bunch of different stuff in an easy fashion, right? We don't have to set up our app with staging data in order to pull that off. And then finally, we get to replicate reported issues with minimal effort and time. So it becomes a little more enjoyable to take on those things that are large problems that hit right away in production and we need to solve them. It's like, okay, no problem, we got this. We can just dive right in and get that taken care of. All right, that's a wrap. Was mentioned earlier, Briebug, they're great. The whole team knows all about this concept. If you're looking for some help or some guidance in implementing this in your team, definitely reach out to them. And thank you very much. I'll be around too if you have any questions.